Well, I think we have a quorum, so we're missing Ron. I know he was planning to join online, and so was Mary. So maybe let's just keep an eye out for any emails if you see from them, just in case they're having trouble logging in. But I think let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. So thank you, everybody, for making time for this. I'm really delighted to see you again. So today we have a pretty packed agenda, and there's three things that I think we need to make decisions on. So confirming co-chair and secretary, voting to approve the meeting minutes from last time, and discussing and perhaps voting on a process for distributing and improving meeting minutes in the future. So those are the only three things we need to make decisions on this evening. Otherwise, we have two presentations and we'll be having some discussion. Are there any items that are not on the agenda that people feel that we need to discuss this evening? Yeah.
Just one suggestion of the future agenda items that would be agreeable to the group and appropriate as they have a category for maybe additional items, things that come up after the posting of the agenda that we might bring to the table as information that would be going on or opportunities. So
as long as it's not just a decision or a vote, you can be flexible like that.
That's a great suggestion. Thank you. Yeah.
Could I also just make a suggestion also that maybe have everything posted by Friday prior to the meeting?
We do that.
Okay, and then because there were emails coming in, so I don't always check my sounding emails, so anything that comes in for Friday, but I probably am not going to really be prepared.
Yeah, actually, everything was posted. It was posted in advance of Friday.
Yeah.
The public agenda posting was closer to the deadline, but everything that we're going to discuss tonight was shared with this group.
Yeah, and I learned something in this process too. The night's agenda that I sent out with times and everything is not the formal agenda. So now I know we need a formal agenda that follows the typical format. So anyway, we'll get all of that for Friday in advance of the next meeting. Thank you for the reminder.
Only because I think Jack sent an email on Tuesday.
yes.
So sometimes I just don't. By Friday, I just the planning department has been trained. They have it by Friday. So then I kind of receive it.
Yeah, I apologize for that.
Yeah.
We were first time complications. So maybe we can, going forward, have it ready and posted by Friday. The formal one, if that's easier.
Yeah, or any, like, whatever, as long as, I'm not as concerned about the formal one, but just whatever has to get reviewed.
Right, yes.
Yeah, we'll continue to do that and make sure it's clear that anything comes after that won't be reviewed.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so I would like to go around now and introduce our new member, Lisa. Have you introduced yourself? And then if we have a moment, well, we're running a little bit behind, but I would just like everybody to say their name so that Lisa knows who everybody is. So go ahead.
So I'm Lisa Troy. I am representing the school board. I have 18 years of experience in education, teaching science, teaching climate change, but then I left education about 2 years ago and joined a renewable energy company that aggregates extracts.
Thank you.
And I'm off the door representing the Conservation Commission.
Jack Turner, environmental coordinator, representing the town.
I'm Dr. Leskey. I'm a physician scientist in environmental health.
And I'm Maggie Field and I represent the board.
I'm Tracy Dye-Brennan. I'm here out of interest for climate change.
Alex Concha, I'm representing Sustainable Milton and the data scientist in the financial services division.
Josh, you want to go ahead?
I am Josh Eckertley, Assistant Town Planner.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome, Lisa. Okay, so I also just did want to check how we want to how we want to refer to each other. I know some committees are formal and go by last names and titles, and other committees, I don't know, maybe some go by first names. Does anyone have a preference about that?
I'm going by first names.
I second that.
Yes. And we're going to need to vote.
Okay, that's great.
Dr. Maggie.
Oh, just another question. I know there's still a representative from the chamber.
Yes.
So I know I'm part of this chamber, and so I know they're not meeting until September.
Okay.
So I'm just a little hesitant getting too deep in things until all the positions have been, I don't, yeah.
Well, I think my sense is what we're going to discover today is there is a lot to talk about before we do anything. There's a lot to learn and discuss. So I have a feeling that through September, we may be very busy, active, learning, talking, but not making like binding decisions. Okay, so the next item is confirming the co-chairs and secretary. So at our last meeting, Alex had initially offered to be the secretary, and I had offered to be the co-chair, but that left us without a second co-chair. So at last meeting, we voted to have Alex and I be the co-chairs, but we didn't have a formal secretary. So I'm wondering if anyone is moved to offer to be the secretary or the second co-chair, but Alex has kindly offered to do both roles if there's no volunteers. So just want to check and see if there's any volunteers.
That's awfully generous. Thank you.
And if not, I know that Alex is excited to take careful minutes and get them out to the public.
You know, learn how to do this.
Yeah. All right. So then I'm looking for a motion because we've already elected us as co-chairs. I think the decision we need to make is about Alex being secretary. Is there a motion?
So moved.
There's a second. Second. Okay, all in favor? Wonderful. All right, so Alex will be the secretary and also the co-chair. And we've agreed that in these roles, we'll work together to prepare the agendas, but I will facilitate the meetings unless that changes, and then we'll figure it out. Okay, so then the next thing is the meeting minutes. These were distributed ahead of time, and I'm wondering if anyone has any corrections. Okay. So if there are no corrections, then are the minutes approved?
We need a motion for that?
Yes.
I move to approve the minutes.
Second. All right, all in favor? Wonderful. We're all learning how to do this. So this is democracy in action. All right. The next thing is Alex and I had talked a little bit prior to coming to this committee in general about transparency for these kinds of committees and just making sure that we keep the public informed as to what we're doing and share the meeting minutes in a timely way. So Alex, would you like to say anything about
Yeah,
that?
so I put together some notes about what I want to propose here. As I said at the last meeting, I think it's particularly important for this committee's work to be easily acceptable and easily followed by residents of the town, especially as we start making those decisions. And I love to strive to exceed the minimum bar for how quickly we can post minutes so people can follow what we're doing without having to wait a full month to get an update on what we discuss or find time to watch the entire meeting. And then the typical timeline is to take a formal vote of the committee to approve the minutes at the next meeting. In our case, that would be a month at least a month later. So was looking on the sort of mass.gov guidance around committee public body minutes, and it mentioned that public bodies may choose the method for approving the minutes, including approval by the public body chair alone, by majority vote, the public body by consent of the body. So we have flexibility about how we do it. And I want to propose the following sort of general process, and then I have a motion. If everybody agrees to sort of report our consent to this. After the meeting, the secretary, I guess that's me, will produce draft minutes within 5 business days. I would try to do it faster, but Tracy wisely asked me to give myself a little more flexibility. And then as co-chair, we review them, make preliminary edits, and then circulate them to the committee electronically. And give you all 5 business days for corrections or objections. And absent those, or it will obviously incorporate any corrections, but absent any objections, the co-chair would approve minutes, and that should be the typical outcome. But in the presence of objections, we can wait until the next meeting to get it on the agenda to discuss, make sure that we come to agreement and approve it necessary. Is there any feedback or questions to that? Does that sound reasonable?
It sounds reasonable.
And the only thing that I think usually if there are any changes, that it's nice to be done publicly. So in case anybody from the public has a comment or they can hear our discussion or on that. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know.
Are you saying if there are changes to the minutes, like the draft minutes are circulated and there's changes from that, and we'd like that to be discussed in a
Public, yes.
And I think that's what Alex is. So if there were any.
If there's some routine change where it's the last time you mentioned the technology, or I took down something, I transliterated, I had no idea what if I wrote down it was correct, right? I would, under this process, I would have circulated my notes with a misspelling. That's not what it is still. Whatever it was. I don't think that there's a compelling need for that kind of change to be public, versus making the materials available sooner. If there's something contentious, I think you could object and say, let's take this to the next meeting.
Not that it has to be contention, but even if someone's name and address, whatever. I don't know.
Well, I guess how can members of the public, even if we discussed it at the meeting, how did they get their input?
Yeah.
Until they've actually seen the minute.
So let me just back up a moment. Are we saying that we post the draft minutes as approved by the 2 co-chairs? And then if we need any comments to those between then and the next meeting, and the vote of the next meeting, and then the revisions to appear at that time?
I think that's a different proposal, and that could work too. That I think what Alex was saying, if I heard you correctly, was that the minutes would be circulated on the committee, approved by the committee, and then, assuming there was nothing substantive, and then it would be posted. Whereas I think what you just said, if I heard you right, would be posted and then approved, but so available to the public, but approved after that at the next meeting. Did I hear that right?
The draft meetings. Yeah, you did.
Okay.
So the draft meetings could go up as determined by the 2 co-chairs. Then there would be time considering people's schedules and so on. bring input, and then final vote for the next week. We'd have to have we'd have to have a meeting to vote on.
Well, I think if we choose otherwise, we don't have to do that. And I was going
For the committee to approve the minutes, it would have to be in a public meeting. But if we were to follow what is allowed by the state that Alex has mentioned about chair approval, that would not have to be at a public meeting.
So basically, I was going to move to allow chair approval on the condition the meetings have been circulated and there have been 5 business days for the committee to provide feedback or objections.
But then the minutes would be formally approved in the public, so it's been voted.
yes, and posted. I'm personally comfortable with the idea of posting draft minutes. I think I suggested that earlier on, and I think Josh had some concerns about the potential for confusion. Making draft versus approved minutes accessible. I know that these things can get more complicated than we expect.
Yeah, but the draft minutes, so I understood what you said, would be also seen by the chair before they're posted. So you have 2 people looking at them, so I don't see that there's an issue there. And then we're approved at the next meeting.
I just think it's where you guys have an opportunity. Yeah.
At least some degree of safeguard. I think it's actually an adequate safeguard that 2 people are looking at them before they're posted.
And you would also have the opportunity to look at them.
Yeah, and then once they're posted, everybody gets a chance to look at them, including the committee. But even if you're saying the committee would see them first, or just the maybe I'm getting confused, but I thought your proposal was that you would draft the minutes, show them to the chair, and then they would be posted for.
And my proposal was that I would draft the minutes, show them first to the chair, show them to all of you, wait 5 business days for feedback, then we would approve. Not with a formal approval from you, but in the absence of objections.
And we would be posted as draft.
We could post it as drafts, but
Because they would be formally approved of me.
So I think we have maybe a merging of 2 proposals, which could be a happy conclusion. So let me just see if I can summarize that. So Alex would take the minutes, he would circulate them first to me, and then to this committee within 5 business days. This committee.
To everybody simultaneously.
Yeah, it could be that way. Yeah, okay.
Save time and stress.
Yeah.
does anybody have concerns with that? I just remember hearing some that I don't have.
Okay, so let me just see it through then. So Alex takes the minutes, circulates them to the entire committee within 5 business days. If there's no objection, they're posted as draft, and then they're formally approved at the next meeting.
So 5 business days for him to go to us,
Draft.
5 business days for us to respond and give feedback. At that point, they become draft minutes. Then at the next meeting, they get officially approved.
I think that is the kind of
step.
the combined proposal.
And I think, Alex, you're saying there is a flexibility for you to just make them final.
Right, but I don't personally care about that too much, so whatever, people would rather make final approval at the next meeting. The thing that matters to me is that they're available to the public this would have them available to the public in about 2 weeks instead of 4.
So 2 questions. One, what if someone's on vacation or they cannot respond within 5 days? And then 2, you're breaking the open meeting law by sending our drafts to everyone, our edits to everybody, because then we can't have a dialogue back.
I think, the guidance on math.gov is we don't have to have public vote, the chair can approve it unilaterally if we choose to work that way. So I think this is much more transparent than that. I'm not particularly worried about. Again, this is in the spirit of the open meeting law that we're trying to make our proceedings transparent more quickly.
So let me just circle back to your two concerns. The first concern is what if someone's on vacation or isn't able to get in that time? So I think if things are posted as draft, they're not finally approved. So if someone was on vacation and then they came to the next meeting and they said, wait a minute, that's not right at all, they would still have an opportunity to fix it before they're finally approved. Does that address that concern for you? Okay. And then the second piece is a concern about sending out edits to the minutes, and that might be against the open meeting law because they're not.
Correct, and that's part of our discussion that should be taken in public.
Mm-hmm.
So even if it's a minor, like someone had changed the address or, so that is still, so if I sent an edit to you saying, oh, this person actually doesn't live in, 80 can't now, they live in 40 can't now, and then you replying back is actually, I think, a discussion, which then is a violation of the meeting law.
If it's the same topic, one step line. I think I hear what you're saying.
Can't they go back from you, for example, to Alex and nobody else without constituting any violation of the open meeting?
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's under just one.
Right.
But then Alex would then, how would he get the information to,
To be the draft.
in the draft, which wouldn't be approved in the.
Right. And then to be revised as you suggested
Yeah.
at the.
Just want to allow for the happy path where the meetings are substantively, the minutes are substantively correct. They get out in some form to the public quickly. And if we want to make minor revisions in public meeting, I think that's fine. Yeah. It sounds like there's a preference for posting draft minutes and still formally approving.
And the caveat for you would be to make sure that anybody responding to you for the draft meetings would do so just to you.
Yes. Yes, and I think that kind of goes along with that there would be no back and forth discussion or,
And that's what Megan wants to avoid.
Yeah, that's a good
And I think it's a great objective to get them out, because there are committees who haven't posted anything for you.
That's what I want.
So it's very good.
It's necessary for the legitimacy of this group to be better than.
Yeah. And so then I was also wondering, so what is the norm for committees that meet only once a month? Because I think the law is you have to post it within 30 days, I think.
Or 3 meetings.
Or 3 show.
Yes, so we go on the floor, that's not very good.
Yeah. Yes, we don't want to.
If it's a Google Doc or something where you can comment on it, I mean, how is that looked at?
It sounds like that would be an issue with the open meeting law.
Although this meeting's minute, the last meeting's minutes were on the SharePoint as an editable document. So
Yeah, you can comment on it as long as you don't respond to another committee member's comments, making it deliberation. Committees that meet on a monthly basis approve their minutes at the next meeting, even if it's, 35 days, how their sort of monthly thing breaks down. And it's just 30 days is the best practice. And within 10 days of a request by a resident is what the open meeting law requires. But it's not, at 31 days, we're going to get sued. It's just a guidance and a recommendation.
So we had a good discussion on this. I wonder if there's a motion to summarize this. I can try, but Alex, do you want to try to summarize?
so I got a motion that involves allowing the chair to approve.
Yeah, I think
We're not doing that, so I wonder if we need a motion to be posted draft minutes early.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then motion,
I was just sort of describing the high level.
So maybe what we're discussing is just a modification of what we would do anyway, but it's not different because the meeting minutes would still be approved at the next meeting. So this is probably good, with a reminder to all of us as we comment back on the minutes, not to get into a discussion about it. And you can also then know what to expect in terms of when I was going to share the draft minutes.
So would it be better to have a motion saying that we will be posting draft minutes? This.
I think it seems okay. So I think we need a motion.
so the other question is, yeah, if you don't post that, then you get a violation of her.
I think if we had a motion or we said we would, then
Yeah.
more problem.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's very good practice.
Yes.
It's total practice.
So,
I think what we're talking about is a practice, not a policy.
yeah.
Okay. that's a
Please
good
don't make a
decision.
motion on this for my benefit.
Okay.
Okay. All right, good. Well, this is a good discussion. It's helpful to kind of know what the expectations are and to, the goal here, I think we all share is public transparency and making it possible for, say, if someone wanted to attend this meeting from the public, we want to make sure that they can know what we're going to be talking about, what we talked about last time. All right, so we are a little bit behind, but I think that was a worthwhile discussion. We are going to next go to the staff review of the greenhouse gas inventory. Jack, are you going to be doing that, or is it Josh?
So we do have preliminary numbers from that assessment. Josh,
Let's get into it. I'm just going to ask if you might be able to tighten up the time a little bit. We had allocated 10 minutes, but if you can go a little faster.
I have one sentence to share with the committee on this. Milton's, we have the first draft of the GHG numbers. They haven't been fully technically reviewed, so it won't be submitted as an official document yet until we get that full technical review. But our initial numbers show a 1.2% increase in emissions from 2017 to 2022. That's just under 279,000 metric tons to then 282,000 metric tons. In 2017, which is our base year, 46% of our emissions were generated by stationary sources, buildings primarily, and about 53% were generated by transportation, with additional minor emissions from waste and construction. In 2022, those numbers grow slightly for buildings at 46.4% of emissions from buildings, and then 51.8 reduced a little bit for transportation. So that's sort of what we're working on, sort of 45 for buildings, 50 for transportation at a very general baseline. We'll get harder numbers and a more complete report in the coming weeks following that technical review. But what we've also got is the second phase of our contract with Apex, who are GHG consultants, are bringing in some of their communication specialists to help us develop some engagement materials, including potential logos, plans, sort of titling and language, as well as iconography and color schemes. We would love the committee's initial thoughts on what would be appropriate, as well as continued feedback as that process continues. Thank you.
Thank you for the update,
Josh, a question. Is there a relationship being developed that indicates the amount of building that has gone on in the town relative to that increase in emissions? So that, for example, if building increased twice as much percentage-wise as the emissions, I think that would be very important to know.
So we did calculate the change in gross square footage of both residential and commercial businesses in Milton in that 5 years. That is not represented in these initial numbers in terms of like that relationship between growth in residential and commercial square footage versus stationary building energy emissions. But that's certainly a relationship that we can pull once we get the final numbers.
On the same lines, have study been done to see if more trees or more open space in town have been removed?
I don't believe there's not a tracking mechanism to see like canopy cover in an official way and measure that, Maggie. But I know we've got some sort of basic extrapolative numbers in terms of development and what that typically yields in reduction of green space.
Quick question, is residential electricity consumption included in that stationary sources bucket?
Yes.
Is the scope 2 emissions?
Yes, and for the municipal emissions, which they're doing an entire municipal GHG inventory as a sub element to this. They have specific numbers in terms of the total square footage of our municipal buildings and our municipal billing charts to see exactly what our consumption is at a municipal level.
I assume scope 3 emissions are not included.
Yeah, I think there is.
So yeah, no, they have scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions being calculated.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, which scope 3 emissions, because they mentioned things like my Amazon purchases. It couldn't possibly be in there because you have no data on them at all.
Of course not.
2 things, if I may. First, building on what Maggie said in emphasizing the important metrics, might we bring Branch Lane and Laura Beebe into the conversation about the shade trees so that we have an idea of what the threshold metric might have been with the 350 initiative, and then where they are now and what their plans are for the out years.
So I can say that they do have a shade tree inventory, but only for street trees. I don't believe they have any method to track any canopy change in private or any other type of land besides the street trees. I don't think there's any data on that.
At least from the shade data on the street committees, I think that'd be
okay.
great asset.
I believe that data is available somewhere. I know my master's was in the School of Forestry, so I know folks who worked with remote sensing data. So you can use satellite data to estimate canopy cover. So they do that with, national forests and the like.
So that data is used for wildfire risk calculation.
All kinds of things.
The question is whether anybody is in the market to provide that data to small town residents for a reasonable cost.
I'd like to do a
That
little.
would certainly be helpful in your broader climate action plan. In the scope of our inventory, I don't think it works with our contract.
So I just like to do a time check because we're spending a little bit more time on this agenda item, and I think you all will be bringing back more information about this inventory once it is ready for review. Is that right?
Yes.
That's correct.
Arthur, did you
I
have
just have the second perspective, and I'll be very quick, and that is whether or not we're thinking about doing any forecasting on what the levels of metric tons are going to be relative to new construction in the town, 40Bs, Winter Valley, Memory Care Center, et cetera, and what they would be over a certain timeline. I just put that on the table without need for discussion now.
That's great. Thank you.
We do have projected scenarios out to 2050, but those are based off of population data and our sort of history of construction, not based off of the sort of comprehensive list of construction projects in the pipeline.
And just also because a large percentage is transportation, are you looking with the traffic committee to see if how many of those or what percentage of that percentage of cars is passing through town?
Yeah, so the data is partly from MassDOT, which has essentially data that you can geofence, for lack of a better word. So it shows the transit that goes, crosses border from Milton and then out of Milton. So it already calculates and shows that cut through traffic. I don't know yet, or if they will be doing a breakdown of what is from outside of Milton through Milton, out of it, or what is strictly internal. But that is part of the MassDOT data that we were explicit in gathering. So yes, but we haven't met with the Traffic Commission on that. I'm sure that will be an important part of your role on this committee.
This is excellent feedback. So we look forward to hearing from you when you have that inventory sort of more ready, but more details to present. But as you are hearing, it sounds like there's a lot of good input on different connections that we can make, different data that we want to make sure is accounted for. So thank you everybody for the feedback. Okay, so we're going to go on to the next item now, and I'm going to make this very brief as well. But if you could pull up the presentation deck relating this committee's charge to the state's climate goals, that would be helpful.
Right. Is that the introduction to Milton's climate efforts?
It's this one.
Okay.
I don't think it's called introduction to Milton's climate efforts. It's called Relating State 2030 and 2050 Goals to Milton CAP.
I'm not seeing that. Is that in the shared?
I sent it out by email. I don't think I put it in the shared directory. And while you pull it up, I can just kind of start talking about it a little bit because there's not a lot of visuals here. But what I wanted to do just to ground our conversations as we start to think about what we're going to do as a committee and how we're going to work together is to talk to you a little bit about what our charge is, which we mentioned last time, and then how that charge relates to the state climate goals, because we're working within a broader context of what the state of Massachusetts is trying to do. And I think our work will be supporting the state efforts. So just as a reminder, our primary charge was 4 elements: to review and evaluate town bylaws, regulations, policies, and make recommendations for strategy related to climate change and paraphrasing. But so we talked about this last time, and we talked about how this task really will be part of the overall climate action planning that we'll do. The second element of the charge is to solicit public input from experts, stakeholders, and residents, and that's a key element of what we'll be doing throughout this process. The third thing is to prepare a climate action plan. So that's something that's, I think we're going to be spending a lot of our time thinking about how to create and actually creating a climate action plan. And then the fourth thing is to measure implementation and progress on the strategies within the climate action plan. So are there any questions about that overall charge? Okay. So if you go to the next page, it's slide 3. And I'll just touch on this very quickly. This mentions what should be included in that climate action plan. I won't go through all of this, but we want to focus on the next decade. We're going to look at overcoming barriers. We're going to make recommendations. We're going to account for environmental justice and protecting environmental justice populations. We're going to make recommendations for implementing the plan. We're going to make recommendations for how to involve stakeholders and tracking and reporting on progress. So this is in the charge itself, telling us what the climate action plan should include. And I think this is helpful guidance from the select board as we think about starting to create this plan.
Shouldn't this be anything about prevention and preservation?
We are going to get to that later in the agenda. That was not in, this is what the charge says, so it's not really up to us to edit it, but I think as we interpret it, we can talk about prevention, we can talk about adaptation, we can talk about sort of the scope of the plan overall.
I think it makes sense to include that under the broad umbrella of climate action goals. Most of these plans have a resilience adaptation second.
So then let's focus on.
I was just going to suggest that if it's possible, consistent with other strategic planning processes, it might be good to consider having a provision for the reformulation of the plan so that it isn't seen as something that has been stopped, but rather is organic.
A reformulation of the plan or of the charge?
It could be both. Charges should be updated as time passes. The changes are made and conditions are altered in the general environment.
Yeah.
Certainly for the plan so that nobody thinks it's done and dead.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point, and I think it gets to the idea too that this is a long-term process. This is a marathon, not a sprint. Like we're going to be at this for years. Maybe not all of us in this room, but the town is going to be at this for a long time, and we're going to have to adapt.
Generations.
Yeah, that's right. So we're going to have to adapt and keep changing and learning and growing as we work on this. So if you go to the next slide, this is the Massachusetts state climate goals, and these goals have been documented in detailed plans. I won't go through all of them, but suffice to say by 2030, the state's goal is to achieve 50% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. By 2040, we're trying to achieve 75% emission reductions. By 2050, 85% emission reductions, equivalent to net zero when you account for the carbon sequestered by natural recording plants. These are very aggressive goals. They're also what we need to meet to try to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Also in the state goals are ensuring a just energy transition. It is very much baked into what the state is trying to do to make sure that as we transition to more sustainable energy and more sustainable economy, that we're also benefiting all residents and that we're supporting individuals and families with modest incomes and those located in environmental justice communities that have a history of environmental impact. So we really need to think about that equity issue baked into how we're thinking about how we meet these climate goals, and that's set out by the state. So if you can go to the next slide. This just provides a visual from 1990 to 2030 of what up to currently what our emissions have been, and then projected how to meet the goals to 2030. So you can see we've come a long ways from 1990, and we have a long ways to go. And those little triangles are what the emission limits are. So we're on a path where we need to make a steep decline in order to meet our goals. So that just provides a little context. We've made progress. We have a lot more to get.
Is it the town of Milton say that? Or is it
The state?
The state, yeah.
State of Massachusetts. It's right out of the climate plan for 2030 and 2050.
And how does Milton line up in that?
That's a great question. I don't have that data. Maybe when we get the emissions inventory, we can kind of see a parallel structure, so we can kind of see how our trends fit. But if we're having emissions increases, if we just turn that in the wrong direction, so we know that.
Just a quick question. That middle diamond, is that 2025?
I believe so, yes. And then if you can switch to the next slide. So this is my interpretation now, everything else has been straight out of the plans, but as I think about it, we met our goals as a state for 2020, but we need to do a lot more to meet our goals for 2030. And the state plan is focused on 4 sectors: transportation, heating and buildings, electric power emissions, and industrial and natural resources. We're not going to be able to address all of those at the time of Milton, right? We don't have control over all of that, but there are some things that we can do. Municipalities don't, as I understand it, don't have required emissions targets as part of the state plan, but there are definitely things that towns can do to influence progress towards meeting the goal. So that our work is within that context. And then if you switch to the next slide, this is straight out of the plan as well. I looked for examples in the plan of where the state talks about working with municipalities. So here are some of the examples that they're thinking about. So for transportation, for example, we could allow more building and housing near transit. We could help increase walking and biking and encourage people to get out of their cars. We could adopt the state's specialized energy building code, that specialized opt-in energy building code that supports efficiency and decarbonization. We can support land conservation and protect our natural land. So these are examples that the state is thinking about how they want to work with municipalities. It's up to us to determine what makes sense for Milton and what we're going to do. That's really all I wanted to cover. Are there any questions about that? Yeah.
I was wondering where we put for Milton the impact on our infrastructure, such as stormwater, increased stormwater demands relative to what we have, like trying capacity, what capacity will be in future public health issues. Under that category, one would be storage in the face of increased impact from climate change, transportation, flooding, for example, Granite Avenue as the estuary of Bronx River changes and its impact beyond that onto Route 93 going into Boston. You probably have these in mind as well.
Well, so what I think you're describing, yeah, no, that's great. And that kind of, and you mentioned this tonight, I think this kind of gets ahead to one of the things I wanted to just talk about, which is the scope of our plan. So I think what you're describing, if I'm hearing it correctly, is all the ways that climate change will impact us, right? Very important.
And how we prepare for that.
And how we prepare for it, how we adapt to it, how we make sure that we're going to be safe in that context. These climate change goals that I was just talking about are talking about mitigation. How do we reduce our emissions to try to stop contributing to the problem? We can potentially talk about both mitigation and adaptation resilience in our climate action plan. So let's get to that, but I think that's a key question we want to talk about when we talk about scope is, do we want to encompass all of those things? So yeah, let's come back to that. Is there anything else about the state goals? Right. So I want to spend some time now, and I think we'll probably want to come back to this more, but talking a little bit about what climate action plans other towns have developed. And I don't know if folks have had a chance to look at any examples. We had pulled together examples from quite a few different towns that have gone before us and have gone through this process of developing climate action plans. And they're all a little bit different. And as we start to think about what kind of plan we want to develop, it's maybe useful to look at some of those examples and think about what did we like? What do we think would be worth adopting? What do we think was not helpful, if anything, in some of those other plans? Are there things that we think are missing? And as we get into this, we don't have time to discuss all of the different plans and all of the different aspects, but I'm curious, and I think it might be helpful for our kind of getting our brains going and starting to think about this task, to just sort of highlight some of the things, if anything jumped out at you as you looked at any of those plans. So I'd like to take about 10 minutes now, if we have 10 minutes worth of discussion, and just kind of see what feedback or thoughts people have to say, looked at any other plans from other towns.
So I can go. So obviously for my questions, I'm more focused on the natural landscape. I think prevention is the key, and the UN has declared this decade as the decade of restoration, and their number one goal or advice is to prevent. So it's easier to prevent than it is to restore. So I don't know if any of you watched Chronicle that last night or the night before, but they did a whole show about nature-based solutions and saving our forests and our urban spaces and our agricultural land. And so that's what I kind of would like to see our plan sort of start with. And if you even go on to, Mass Audubon, so Chronicle is they highlighted Mass Audubon. So I went on their website and got all their information, and they talked about how they support new forests as climate solution as part of the initiative for climate solution. So, the governor announced that forest is climate solution. It's an initiative to slow forest loss and drive Massachusetts towards conserving 40% of natural land by 2050. So that's what I would kind of like to see this plan, focus on is, preservation.
Did you repeat that percentage?
40% to drive Massachusetts towards conserving 40% of natural land by 2050.
The sense of putting it under conservation status.
Or not even necessarily designating it as conservation and under the control and custody of the Conservation Commission. But that is helpful, but it's also creating, setbacks for people that we have side setbacks for when they're building, people are building, maybe we need to have side or back setbacks for keeping green space. So we have a bylaw to part of the charges reviewing our bylaws. We have a bylaw not to pave a certain percentage of our front yards, but maybe we need to look at backyards and side yards. And
So encouraging more natural landscaping on the developed parcels that we do have in addition to conserving.
yeah, and instead of, I think, Ben might have mentioned you mentioned it, Jack, I think, narrowing our roads. So even in some of our bylaws, in subdivision, they're required such large roads. So we need to narrow them or put in more natural landscapes, or when people come to the building department. Again, I don't know how crazy you want to get, unless, people's property or their properties, but if you look at the Wellesley tree bylaw, if a homeowner wants to take down a tree of a certain caliber size, they have to let the town know, because that tree, even though it's on your personal property, it's affecting your neighbor and the community as a whole. So especially on our larger streets. And again, I don't know if there's the cost associated with taking it down. That's a little too deep. So that's what I kind of would like to focus on.
Excellent, that's great. What else do people think about?
Well, I looked at the payment plan, which wasn't in your list, but I just Googled it. And a lot of their recommendations were about, encouraging people and educating people on, and, those things are important. But I feel like those are things that have been happening and are ongoing in most communities. And so I kind of wonder, how do we go above that? And I know we're making recommendations, to a lot of other committees that then need to maybe make changes in rules and zoning and planning and I don't know if there's any teeth to what we recommend or, how all of that works, but I guess I would be interested in looking at, both what can we do to reduce emissions, but also making sure we have the data to understand how various climate impacts could, affect the town. We see what happened in Vermont, 8 inches of rain in 2 hours. What would that look like in Milton? Or the reverse, there's a drought and, we want to preserve our forests, our beautiful blue hills, but now they're on fire. And then the next year we have a, severe rain event, and now we have mudslides, or, all the things we see, what would it look like here, and getting an inventory for that. I think that piece would be really helpful in that encouraging, if people are seeing some of these changes other places, in the news, and what would those events look like here?
I happened across a really interesting data source of that kind, just over the last week in the media coverage of the floods in Vermont. It's called riskfactors.com. I think we looked at it together once too. But I think there's several, and there are more emerging as more people basically, trying to develop products that sell mostly to like insurance companies. But many of them are available publicly as well. So that should absolutely be cool. We'll look at.
I think as we think about reducing emissions 75% from 1990, one of the things that we have to think about in the traffic sector are the roads and tires, because most of the particles that are generated today from today's vehicles are really coming from the road and the tires. They're not coming from the tailpipe anymore. Greenhouse gases are an issue, but as far as emissions and particles, the real problem is where the rubber hits the road. And we really need to think about that from both the town perspective of are we using the best possible road construction and road materials, and even if we switch to electric cars, they still run on tires. And how do we reduce those emissions? Because when you really come down to it, almost all particle emissions from vehicles now are really coming from tires and road, rather than much more than tailpipe. And so I think this is something that we can think about and affect from a local perspective, not necessarily changing tires, but really considering the roads, and our roads of the best materials to reduce those emissions.
And just to clarify, is that concern about climate change, that are the particles contributing to climate change, or is it a health concern, or both?
Well, for sure. Now, we tend to think about greenhouse gases more, but particles certainly play a role in that. Particles that are both primary and secondary particles, and a lot of the secondary particles are catalyzed. Their formation is catalyzed by road dust.
Thank you, that's great. What about anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? Any particular things you want to see or not see, or suggestions for our plan? Yeah.
I have one suggestion, and that is that we might look at what it is that foundation grants are having as criteria in this area. Many years ago, I worked with the Geraldine Rockefeller Dodge Foundation, which had a key focus on the environment, and out of that, we developed the AP Environmental Science course and examination. So foundations set criteria, and then you see whether or not you can fit with them, or if you can extrapolate something from the criteria. And same with criteria that might be used by states beyond Massachusetts, as well as in Massachusetts.
Thank you. It's great.
I can make a comment. I think there's a lot of great specific action items across all these plans for us to chew on and consider for Milton. I think one of the concerns I have reading many of them, I think there tends to be a sort of focus on the emissions mitigation side of the equation primarily, which not that that's not important, but I think given all the things you've heard, it's very much a yes and problem. We have to reduce emissions, but I think it would be silly to expect that we can do just that and not have to adapt or mitigate over the next decades. And then there's the question of how do you actually produce a plan that won't just sit on a shelf. And I think I have a main criticism of a lot of these plans is that they're just overflowing with action items, and they make sense working backwards from these goals, but it's hard to imagine how like a real town section of ours is. So going to your comment, or a lot of them are kind of aspirational. We're going to educate. How do you connect education to the curves that they're going down? Okay. So I think it's important for us to consider the strategy of like, what can we really control from the town? What can we facilitate? So part of the role is, a lot of this is about private behavior, and if I've learned anything from the last 5 years, you can't mandate cultural change, right? So how do you influence cultural change around these things without being ahead of the game with everything?
Thanks. Is there anyone on the Zoom who hasn't gotten a chance to speak to this, who's on the committee? I'm thinking, we did have Ron.
Ron, yeah, he was,
Did he step up?
I
Okay.
don't see him anymore.
Any other comment on this? This is only the very scratching the surface. We obviously have a lot of considering and thinking to do about what belongs in our plan and how to structure it. But I love hearing the diverse ideas here. I mean, I just think you've got a lot of great perspectives, and I know that we'll dig into it more as we go on. All right, so the two other things that I want to talk about before we get to public comments. One is the scope and priorities of the CAP, and we've already started talking about this a little bit, but I just wanted to kind of think about together, how do we draw the boundaries around this plan and what's at a high level, what's included. So, you know, some of the things that I was thinking about are, do we consider climate change mitigation and adaptation? And I've heard in this conversation, it sounds like we really are engaged in both issues. Both are really important. You know, do we focus on what's under the control of or influenced by the town? Do we look beyond that? This is kind of getting to your point, Alice. Do we focus, you know, how do we prioritize? Do we focus on the highest sources of emissions? Do we focus on high impact on residents? You know, where do we put our emphasis, given that this is an enormous problem? And there's maybe other sort of decisions, high level scoping decisions that we want to think about. So I just wanted to lay this out here and see if anyone has thoughts as you start to think about what belongs in a plan for Milton, if we have scoping perspectives.
I would say we should start our focus on like town buildings. Because I think it would be hard to get buy-in from residents in the community unless the town isn't actually, you know, practically reach.
I think we definitely have to admit that their behavior changes from private residents that the state plan assumes need to happen, but not the town, nobody can force people to do these things, right? So I think there's a role for us to play as the town in facilitating things like weatherization, heat pumps, solar panels, making sure that at the town we're at least not creating obstacles where there need to be obstacles. I think there's also a lot of money flowing in for Milton residents to take advantage of through state and federal programs, and the town could play a role in making sure that people are accessing those incentives efficiently, or wherever people are eligible for them, if they're getting them.
I think that'd be huge, because I wouldn't have any idea where to start looking.
Yeah, and that's something that we have tried to do at Sustainable Milton, and we're still learning. We got stuff on our website, but how do you get that so that people see it? Right?
Well, I noticed the town Milton has a new website today.
As of today.
So that could be awesome.
I was like,
Nice job.
am I looking at the wrong town?
Any other thoughts on?
Working to develop a dedicated resilience and sustainability page for the town website. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah, because right now it's sort of split between different departments in their own section on the website.
So in that vein, I think part of the plan needs to be outreach strategy. Because I definitely learned from direct experience. You can do all the research and put a bunch of stuff up on your website. And I've learned a lot in the last 6 months about things like Google Analytics. And I know exactly how many people have visited Sustainable Milton's 3-100 page, like 18 people in the last month. So there's some learning. Hopefully we can find folks in the community who have some expertise around how do you get that information in front of people when they're interested in consuming it, when it's relevant.
I think Josh and I could both say that would really help us in our roles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I would say a lot of these measures like mass save. I mean, everyone in their electric bill gets a little higher, and every year you have an energy audit on your house, you get, free light bulbs and all kinds of rebates if you're going to upgrade an appliance, or I think get like no interest loans or something with installation and the like. So, that's a tremendous resource that everyone in the state pays for, or everyone, the utility pays a little monthly fee for that. So, and it's free. Like, that's a great resource.
So I think I need to take this opportunity to do a public plug for all the thousands of people watching. SustainableMilton.org has a big take action button in the top right hand corner. And we have sort of 15 climate positive actions there. And there are things like doing a mass save energy audit or getting solar on your roof, installing heat pumps. And what we tried to do is give sort of Milton specific information about the steps to take and what incentives are available. So we have compiled a lot of information of that nature to supplement. Obviously, every single one of these programs has its own website. And, so I think the problem is, and I certainly experienced this when I got interested in this stuff, but it's totally overwhelming. And some people want to geek out on it for years, and most people don't. So.
And we have a lot of old houses in town that are particularly, my house wasn't insulated when I moved in. So,
Mine wasn't insulated with burning.
right?
My time I understood that air gap insulation. So what's that?
Okay, so just to bring us back then to the scoping, I think what I'm hearing is we need to consider both climate change adaptation and mitigation, both and. In terms of what's under the control or influence by the town, we need to start with a good example of what the town's doing, and we need to facilitate and help individuals take actions and help them know what incentives and programs and offerings are available. I haven't heard anything about prioritizing in terms of emissions or impact. I'm kind of assuming we start with the highest priority, like what are the greatest emissions, and our emissions inventory is going to be helpful there. And as we're thinking about adaptation, we're going to think most about the things that have the greatest potential impact. I think that goes without saying.
One factor along with feasibility and complexity. There may be simple things that we can do. Like Milton already has the electricity aggregation program. Very simple action for residents to take assignment of the reducing green electricity. Electricity is only 19% of statewide emissions. It's not at the very top, but there's like an easy, cheap action there. Whereas fixing our tailpipe emissions can be a bit complicated.
Yeah.
We're going to have to focus on it, but I think some difference in the beginning would help.
Well, one thing about priorities is that because they have to be prioritized themselves, sometimes it's with contextualizing them in two ways. One is what's having a definition, state definition we can provide. Second is having them on a timeline so that everybody doesn't think everything has to be done at once. Because that's impossible.
Yeah.
So we can actually give a pictorial perspective for consumers as to what the priorities are and then how they fit in timelines or in the downtime.
That's all.
So I just want to, I was thinking about, Josh, I think you mentioned last time that was it 80% of our residents signed up or are taking part in the
That's not quite correct, Maggie. It's about 2/3, about 60%, not 80.
And can you tell on that, how many people actually signed up or versus how many people did not opt out? So some people, they had to opt out.
In the data we've received, and Alex, you can corroborate this because you've also taken a look at it. It's also, I think, in your all of your shared folder. I don't believe they sort of discriminated in that way and broke it down in terms of opt-in versus not opt-out.
So we know how many people are participating in the Milton Green, Milton Basic, and Milton Green 100. If people were automatically opted in, they landed that Milton Green default. And that's the vast majority. You can assume that the households that are in Basic or Green 100, they have explicit choices. So,
Great. Well, I think this is a really good sort of discussion of priorities and helpful suggestions on how we weigh these priorities against each other, because they're not always going to be in perfect alignment. So, yeah, I think these will be good touchstones for us to come back to. With our last few minutes before public comment, I want to just point our attention to something I circulated, the proposed process for developing a climate action plan, and Jack, maybe you can put that up on the screen. This is sort of a potential roadmap. It definitely doesn't need to look like this exactly what we do, but it's a way to sort of think about how do we start this enormous task of writing a climate action plan. And Alex put this together, which I really appreciate because I think it's a good way to kind of organize our thoughts a little bit. Do you want to walk us through this quickly?
sure. Yeah, so I mean, I think given the sheer number of potential action items that might be in a plan, and there are many of them are very complex and people are going to have different feelings about them. I think it would be important to have a kind of explicit brainstorming, call it your ideation phase, where we're sort of inclusively collecting an inventory, like what's the high level structure, what are the areas where we may need to do things, and then collect potential action items in all those areas. So that would be sort of first starting with an outline where I think coming from the top down, what are kind of the big areas that should be in our plan. We've already talked about transportation, electricity and energy, building emissions as being like big areas, waste management. These are sections in most climate action plans. And then there's kind of part two, which is around adaptation, mitigation, conservation, and then strategy, right? So that could be like the three-part outline coming from the top down, and then filling in with detailed potential action items. I think would be the next phase where we're not saying that if we bring something into the discussion at that phase that we all think it's a good idea or that it's even possible, but taking an inclusive approach to building up a candidate list, then prioritizing that based on our judgment, right? So we're not going to probably have time to do real due diligence on all the ideas that we'll encounter during that phase. So we'll have to actually prioritize our due diligence efforts as part of what we need to do. If we're really going to say, hey, this complex thing needs to be in our climate action plan, we need to bring in experts. We need to solicit public feedback, find out how actually doing these things might impact residents, either positively or negatively. That's obviously going to take time. So I think we need a first pass prioritization of which potential action items relevant to the plan we're even going to do that for. And then I think the final plan comes out of after we've been through that due diligence phase for our sort of top prioritized potential action items. Then we have gathered enough information to actually prioritize it down. Right, a final prioritization, write the plan, and whatever it means to finalize the plan. I think bringing it back to the select board. I would think that having it approved at town meeting is not something that will ultimately happen. There will be things in the plan that would require town meeting approval as we actually happen, and that will be part of executing the plan. Anyway, so hopefully that was kind of close to what was written down.
Pretty fun. A lot of what we need to do requires, research and discussion and talking to each other and being into the meeting laws. Are those type of discussions? If I'm emailing a group of us that just say like, I found this cool course of information and it's not a policy, but it's just to help us in our research. How does that work?
Not an expert on open meeting law, but my understanding is that we can't be engaged in debate when we're not in a public forum. So I'm not sure about just sharing information, but I think we probably want to think about in a structured way how this is going to be a lot of work. And so how do we break that up? How do we manage that? How do we make sure that we're sharing that in appropriate structures?
And what you can do is use town staff. So if you did find something that was interesting, we send it to town staff, and then they will distribute it to us. So we don't have to have a conversation back, but you use them as the middleman.
So you sort of get things loaded at the SharePoint
Yes.
and have the town staff do the loading.
That kind of legitimizes it. So it's not.
And then you can talk, how many members are we have now? 9. So you can talk to, 4 people.
Or 3 people,
Yeah.
including yourself.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
A rhetorical question and then a non-rhetorical question. Rhetorical question, will this committee need a budget for work that it will be undertaken over a period of time? Non-rhetorical is there will be town budget implications from the recommendations of the committee. And how do we put that up front into the planning process and work with town administrators to prepare for the appropriate times that they would go to the warrant committee, and then where appropriate, some might not need to go to town meeting, some may need to go to town meeting. But that's good. Financial underpinning of this would be very important.
I think that would be less abstract of a question once we have that kind of candidate list. And then you could say, hey, candidate action item 17C would actually have a significant budget impact on Milton. This is, an advertising campaign led by Sustainable Milton might be 0 impact.
And that makes a lot of sense. But would you not think also would it make sense to let people know early on that there are going to be budgetary requests, so that we get into the planning and budgeting queue and don't after the fact find out we have to wait 18 months before we get submitted a budget when we would like work to be done 12 months beforehand.
So we'll definitely need your input on that. The town budgeting process is complete mystery to me.
Oh, there's some excellent people who can help us with that.
I think it will be important that for recommendations where we know that, for example, there's either federal, state, or private funding available in the form of grants and so forth, that we identify those and point that out as part of our plan, that this can be implemented through this funding mechanism. And I think that would be an important part of what we do, in addition to making the recommendations.
And related to that is the fact that it's not uncommon for there to be joint funding requirements in different percentages, depending upon what the project is, or who the granting party is.
And it's not uncommon among towns that have developed a climate action plan to actually hire a climate and environmental coordinator who's a big part of whose role is to apply for that kind of funding. We talked to a couple in our initial research process who's unusual for a climate coordinator not to bring in more money in grants than they draw on salaries. So it's definitely something we consider.
Which raises the question as to whether or not that has to be done only by an individual town or possibly on a collaborative basis whereby 3 or 4 towns are such a capacity, and then tie into whether or not the county has resources at that level that we could tie into as well.
And then also if there's, a piece of property in town that we want to preserve, and if it has a lot of open space and trees, we could apply to the CAPC, the Community Preservation Committee. Let's say for this year, then next year. We could put in an application for preservation. To get some money that way.
This seems like a really rich topic of discussion. So I am going to suggest that we pick this up again, because I'm really glad you brought it up. I think it does need to be an integral part of our plan and our early thinking about the plan, because there is such long lead times for some of these funding and budgeting considerations. So I'm going to suggest that we pick this up again next time, if that sounds good. And I'd also like to suggest that people continue to think about this process for developing a plan, because I'm hoping that at our next meeting, we might actually come to agreement on what our process is going to be. This is just one possibility. We might want to modify it, add to it, have something entirely different. So I would encourage you to think about that and come ready to discuss it next time. Because I think once we develop that, it will become our work plan, and then that will organize our work and help us kind of plan for how we're going to get, from point A to point B. So with that, we are at 7:24, and I want to make sure that we allow time for public comments. I do think we had a few members of the public who were on Zoom, so let's just check and see if there are any public comments.
I see no hands raised.
Well, with that, I think we can adjourn the meeting.
Yes, I'm there.
All right, all in favor? Thank you so much. It's been really great to have this conversation with you.
It's really hard. Thank you.